Hello everyone, and thank you for watching this video as we talk about Chapter 12 of our Business 670 course. In this particular chapter, what we hope to cover will be the following points as soon as I share my screen with you. Okay, so what we want to share today is Chapter 12 again, and what we'll be talking about will be understanding how organizational design requires managers to look at different combinations. Also, how effective organizational structure needs to be to design to enable the company to increase its product differentiation, as well as reducing its cost structure and build its competitive advantage, and explain why it's important that strategic managers keep the hierarchy of the organization as flat as it possibly can in order to be competitive in today's environment. Also, we want to look at why managers, we talked about that already, to keep the hierarchy as flat as we possibly can. What are some of the advantages of the functional structure, and talk about differentiating between the more complex forms of organization structure and what a company can and should be doing. Our opening case begins with the organization at Apple over on page 395. And as we know, that Apple certainly is one of those companies that has and continues to produce a steady stream of innovative new products and improvements, which they use that to really differentiate themselves from their competition. And we know that it seems like Apple has struggled somewhat since the passing of Steve Jobs, but yet the current CEO, Tim Cook, is really picking up that rein to ensure that that company remains competitive. And this case does do a good job describing how organizational structure and culture has a direct effect on the company's profile. Certainly a good read as you begin this chapter. So with that, let's begin talking about organizational design. And it's really a chapter that examines how managers can go about best implementing their strategies through organizational structure, and as well as developing a culture that's going to aid it in competing in today's economic worldwide community that we're so involved in today. So let's talk about organizational design, starting over on page 397. And strategy really involves around the use of organizational design, and the organizational design definition that you see in our textbook really is the process of deciding how a company should create, use, and combine its organizational structure, its human resources, its control systems, its culture, everything about that particular business and that business model to ensure, again, that that company remains competitive, remains successful, not only in the short term, but in the long term. Part of that organizational design becomes the organizational structure, which that organizational structure really is about how employees are assigned to specific value creation tasks, what are their roles, and how they go about specifically ensuring that those tasks and those roles work together to create value, not only for the company, but equally important, the consumer. And through increased efficiency, through quality, through innovation, and again, through responsiveness to its customers. And the purpose of organizational structure is to coordinate and integrate those efforts so that all employees at all levels of the organization across every organizational function in each business unit, so they're all working together to ensure, again, that the strategic objectives of that business are working in sync to provide value not only for the company, but for its consumers as well. And in today's society, we are a consumer-driven organization. It's all about consumer responsiveness, taking care of the customers or the consumers. Part of this deals with How do we go about using our control system? And the purpose of a control system is to provide managers with hopefully a set of initiatives or incentives that's going to motivate employees who's going to work together to increase the efficiency, quality, innovation, as well as customer responsiveness. How they go about doing specific feedback on how well the organization and its members are performing, so that it's maintaining its competitive advantages, so that managers can take a look at and continuously take action that's going to improve its business model. Equally important that goes along with control system is organizational culture. Organizational culture, part of that organization design, is the specific collection of values, its norms, its beliefs, its attitudes that are shared by the employees and groups within the organization. Is really about how the organization does its business each and every day. It's the way that company is going to be doing something. It's that culture that is formally expressed in its rules, policies, and procedures, but equally important, the informal process of the characteristics, the individuals, how that organization is made up, the leadership attitudes and its attributes, the employees' attitudes and attributes. All of that is that informal organizational culture. But yet it is still equally important to the overall success. And a manager in today's environment has to understand how that culture is working, because it is a live mechanism, and how they can use that again to the benefit to create value not only for the company but equally important the consumers, the all important consumers, and that includes you and I as well. Organizational structure, control, and culture are a means by which that organization motivates and coordinates its members to work towards achieving those goals. In this example over on page 398, I believe, figure 12.1 is just a way in which a graphical representation of how the organizational design and structure can work. Not all organizations are like this, but this is just an example of one as you go through organizational design. What is it you want it to do? What are the attributes you're looking at? What are the ways you're going to coordinate and motivate your employees? And that final step is you're doing all this part of this organizational design, which includes these three elements or these four elements, so that you can achieve superior performance. And that's what it's really all about. And this is just a graphical representation of that again over on page 398. So now let's talk about some of the building blocks of organizational structure. When we talk about value creation activities of its organizational members, that's really about how they go about doing their business. And if they don't have some type of structure to use that's going to assign people to tasks and connect the activities of the different people and its functions, then it's almost meaningless. So managers today must take this, understand this, and really drive it down probably to a couple of key points. One of those being, what's going to be the best way to group tasks into functions and to group those functions into business units or divisions that's going to create that organization's distinctive competencies so that they can pursue a particular strategy. Another consideration is how they go about allocating authority and responsibility to those functions and divisions, whether it's going to be centralized or decentralized type of decision making and autonomy. Another one would be, how can it go about increasing the level of coordination or integration between the different functions and divisions as the structure evolves and becomes more complex, or becomes more complex from a standpoint possibly of being a heavily bureaucratic type of organization. And we've seen that the bigger organization becomes, the more bureaucracy that gets created, and that bureaucracy has what is called a bureaucratic cost, which is a cost of doing business. which has a direct impact on the profitability of the company. In some cases, it has that direct impact. So we always want to strive to maintain and minimize the bureaucratic cost of any organization, because that's additional burden that's placed on the organization that may impact their profits that's more than not going to be passed on to the customers. So as we go about grouping some of these tasks and functions in divisions, because the organization tasks are in some cases so large, that becomes a function of its strategy. And the dominant view today is that companies will choose a form of structure to match their organization strategy. A function then is a collection of people who work together and perform the same task or hold similar positions in the organizations. And as the organizations grow, they potentially produce a wider range of products, and the amount of complexity that occurs, especially in the handoffs. And that handoffs really is where the work exchanges or transfers among people, functions, and subunits, which may increase. As the organization grows, communications and measurement problems and managerial inefficiencies surrounding these handoffs may be a issue, may be a concern, and because of these inherent bottlenecks is where this major source of bureaucratic cost is developed. And a division or grouping of functions may allow some of these organizations to better produce and transfer its goods and services to its consumers, thereby decreasing that bureaucratic cost. So that the way the organization is set up, they must match their structure to their strategy, and they want to match that in such a way that they're minimizing this bureaucratic cost, especially when it comes to handoffs or transfers of responsibilities across the different organization perspectives. So allocating in authority and responsibility, starting over on page 399, as an organization grows and produces a wider range of its products, goods, or services, the size and numbers of the organization will increase, hopefully, as the organization grows. And I use the word hopefully from the standpoint that any organization wants to grow, should want to grow to improve its market ability to provide its goods and services, but it does not want to grow to a point where the bureaucratic cost becomes so overburdened. It really needs to find a very fine balance between the two. But if it continues to grow, then the number of handoffs or transfers between the employees increases, and as a result of that, the bureaucratic cost may potentially increase. Coordination between that particular divisions, functions, managers may become more complex, and we have this hierarchy of authority, or who's the chain of the command. How do we go about defining each manager's relative authority, beginning with the CEO all the way down through the middle managers to the first line managers and directly to the employees, who's going to be having to provide direct interface or produce the goods and services for our customers. So every manager at every level of this hierarchy of authority really is looking at what's going to be their span of control. And that really, span of control really refers to the number of employees or subordinates who directly supports a manager. Pretty straightforward, as we know. And most organizations today, which I know you have studied this already, deals with whether it's going to be a tall or flat structure. This is figure 12.2 over on page 400. And a company must choose the number of hierarchical levels that they're going to need in order to ensure their distinctive competencies are being maximized, that's creating value on a daily basis. We know as an organization grows in size or complexity, as the number of employees increases, the number of functions increases or divisions, this hierarchy of authority typically lengthens, which makes it, in this example, become a taller organization. Taller organizations compared to a flat structure, and this flat structure was really what came about in the 90s, where a lot of middle managers were decimated in the ranks because organizations realized that the bureaucracy of being a tall organization was making it more difficult to get things done. Communications was slowed, decisions were delayed, so they leveled out the organizations by flattening the structure, as we see here. And if you don't have to look too far in your own organizations to see the difference between a flat and tall structure and which one typically works better, where the level of autonomy and the responsibility relies, whether it's a centralized or decentralized type of decision making process. But as we think about more bureaucracy in an organization, the more difficult it is really to get decisions made. And I think if you look at, as an example, state and federal governments, at how big they are and how big they have become compared to some private industries, you can certainly see the differences in decision making and bureaucracy, rules and regulation, policies and procedures between the two. So a flatter organization certainly is more nimble, quicker to respond to what's going on in the market because of the decentralized decision making and the level of autonomy that's granted. But we know that as the hierarchy becomes taller, problems within that organizations will occur. Several of those we've already talked about, being the communications problems as a result, because there's so many levels in the organization. Another communication could be from the result of the distortion of the commands and orders that are transmitted up and down the hierarchy, which causes some managers at levels to interpret the communications different. And the one thing that you have to have in the chain of command is clear, concise communications to ensure that everyone is doing the very same thing, again, that's going to support value for the organization and the customers. And tall hierarchies usually indicate that an organization is employing way too many managers, which creates another managerial problem of bureaucratic cost, but equally important, bottom line costs because of the managerial salaries, benefit officers and secretaries and things of that nature that's going to have that supporting structure to support those middle managers. And this is where a lot of companies back in the 90s, when they use the term right sizing, downsizing, re-engineering, is when they were looking at their staff, including middle managers, and again, they were decimated back in the 90s to flatten these organizations. Well, one way to overcome that, and what they did again back in the 90s, was to minimize this chain of command. And it really was where they were looking at trying to determine how many employees, how many managers, what's going to be their span of control, so that they can minimize this cost. But that was the bottom line, to minimize the cost. But equally important, to have the organization to be more flexible, more adaptable, so that the minimum chain of command, that they were going to choose the fewest levels of authority possible to ensure that the resources were efficiently and effectively applied each and every day, again, to create value for the customers and well as the company. And managers, when they do that, they're constantly, hopefully, learn from that, scrutinizing their hierarchies to see what is the correct number of levels that can be reduced and how can they do that in a way in which the companies can compete today on a global level. And it really is a way in which most companies will do that, again, to become flexible, to become adaptable, to be able to respond to the changing market conditions as a way to lower cost. And when a company becomes too tall, their chain of command too long, strategic managers tend to lose control over the hierarchy, which means they potentially will lose control over their strategy. And as a result of that, they miss out on new product innovations, new motivations to change the organizations between employees and functions. Bureaucratic costs typically will increase. They're really missing out on the next big market change or the next big technological change or even the next big human resource changes in human resources. So that's the reason why bureaucratic costs is such a detriment to businesses today. It is really, really about how they're going to move forward to, again, become more flexible. One of the strategies in action over on page 402 deals with Disney. And that's a great case that illustrates the importance of choosing between centralized or decentralized type of organization. Disney clearly, I think that time was Bob Iger was the CEO, and he clearly saw that they were losing. Their ideal generation was not what it used to be. Innovation was taking a downturn, so he went about flattening the organization. He went about decentralizing that so that he could find that right balance between centralized and decentralized that's going to improve um, the the um, the bottom line so that innovation, new ideas would flourish once again. So that's a very interesting read as well. So which one is best, decentralized or decentralized? It's really going to depend on the type of organization and what is their mission. Obviously, some organizations, and I'll use the military, they're very hierarchical. We use the healthcare industry, very hierarchical. There are just some things where you cannot afford to allow people to kind of free will on their own. Some organizations you can. But a way to reduce the bureaucratic cost is to decentralize the authority. In a way in which to do that is that you centralize managers in a division or a function so that they can make the decisions specifically. Some of the advantages of that when top managers delegate those operational decision making responsibilities, they reduce the information overload and they are able to spend more time on developing strategy that's going to competitively position the company and hopefully strengthen this business model as well. Another way is that they can decentralize, which promotes flexibility, reduces bureaucratic costs because lower level managers now have the authority to make on the spot decisions. And those of you who are studying Nucor Steel, that's one of their tenets there, is that they really were decentralized. They decentralized the steel industry, has given each local entity the autonomy to make those decisions, especially when it comes to their production and how they go about that. But they also recognize that their individual production was equally tied to the overall corporation productions as well. Great business model to study when it comes from that. Centralization also has some advantages because that centralization makes it easier for coordination of the organizational activities. There's that trying to find that correct balance because all the decisions really come down from the top and you just, in essence, do hopefully what you're told. So there's some advantages to that as well. Centralization also means that decisions fit or that the CEO and the board also ensures that the decisions fit into the overall broad objectives of the organization. And when there's a time of crisis, centralization of authority permits strong leadership because authority is focused upon one person or one group. Certainly allows for speedier decisions, get away from what I think or you think, and you're just getting directions. If you think about the University of Mount Olive, we have the various campuses located in eastern North Carolina, and we use a hybrid approach. We have centralized decision making at the main campus. When it comes to the academics, that's given out to the site directors about who's going to teach, when they're going to teach, what classes are going to be offered, where the actual where they're going to be sitting at, The coordination of the utilization of the resources there at the facilities really is centralized. Also, how they go about doing some of their local marketing is decentralized to the site directors. So it's a combination of both. Another example, when I was at my former employer, we worked at a power plant here in eastern North Carolina, and we were our own identity. We had our own budget. We made our own decisions about how the plant was going to operate based on this licensing criterion. But we recognized that what we did had to play into the overall corporation and its financial returns as well as its strategies. So it was another example where we had decentralized decision making, but we also balanced that with the centralized organizational goals. So it worked out very well. So it really depends on the type of organization that you are involved in. Equally important, over on page 403, when we talk about integration and the integrating of these mechanisms, it's really about how managers need to go about using various integrating mechanisms to increase its coordination and communication across the different functions and divisions, which gives the organization greater flexibility of its structure, and it also hopefully improves the coordination among its people. They do that through several different ways, one of those being direct contact, where direct contact allows managers to create a context in which the managers from different functions and divisions can work together to solve their mutual problems. Another way is through liaison roles, where managers can increase the coordination by establishing liaison roles. And usually the responsibility for coordination of a liaison is a full-time job and type of an informal relationship where that person is kind of that intermediary who's transmitting information across the organization with that larger perspective, where hopefully that liaison is building trust across the organization, who has the best interest of the organization in its entirety and not just one specific division or function. Another way to do this is through this integrating mechanism is through teams, where two or more functions may have ongoing problems or common problems, and where direct contact and liaison roles may not provide sufficient coordination. In this case, they can do a more complex integrating mechanism called the team, where it may be more appropriate where one manager from each function or division is assigned a team that comes together to solve a specific mutual problems, and then those team members are responsible for reporting back to their specific subunits as they go about addressing some of those problems. So there's multiple ways in which these integrating mechanisms will work. What's going to be the best one? A great question. It could be, again, based on the type of organization and what the services and the functions that are needed to ensure it maintains its competitive advantage. Strategic control systems over on page 405 is another way in which managers can choose which organization structures or strategies that they need to pursue to ensure that the resources of the organization are used effectively and efficiently to support its business model in support of creating value and profit for the organization. And they go about doing this by creating strategic control systems. And these strategic control systems is just the way in which how a company will develop key performance indicators or things of that nature by which they're going to monitor and evaluate whether their strategies are working effectively. And in a way that they're doing that is really about monitoring how well the organization and its members are currently performing. Or in other words, a measure of how well the firm is using its existing resources. And in your businesses, like our businesses today, one of the key thing that you see as far as monitoring how well an organization is using its existing resources is what's the key financial information of that organization? How's it profit? How its rate of return? What's its leverage? What's its net profit? What's its sales doing? What's its stock prices doing? What's the dividends? Is it consistent, continuing them quarter to quarter? Those type of financial structures is probably one of the first things a strategist will look at to determine, to aid in determining how well that organization is working. And it's also about how do we go about creating incentives that's going to keep the employees motivated and focused on what are the important problems that is impacting the organization, and how can they go about focusing their efforts to ensure that organization is finding solutions that can help that organization perform better over time. It's also about how strategic managers can obtain superior efficiency, their quality, their innovation, and responsiveness to customers. Again, those four basic building blocks of competitive advantage. And let me state those one more time. For strategic control managers, it's the superior efficiency, quality, innovation, and responsiveness to customers. And an effective control system really has several characteristics. One of those being that it's going to be flexible enough to allow managers to respond necessary to unexpected events, especially in today's competitive global environment in which we operate in. It also should provide accurate information, thus giving a true picture of the organizational performance, and it should provide managers with information that is timely, because making the decisions based on outdated information is a recipe for failure. So how they go about developing this, these basic structure competitive advantage really depends again on the type of organization that it is. But one way to look at it here is the steps in designing an effective organizational structure. Over on page 406, 407, establish the standards, create the measures of performance, compare those against the standards, and evaluate the results. And a true company will also have a feedback loop where they're feedback into any one of these at any given point in time, so that as the market conditions change, they could be flexible and adaptable to make those moves if necessary. Now, care has got to be taken that in doing any of these steps that do not create problems at the next level. That's why providing constant feedback, constant monitoring will be paramount in doing that. The different levels of the organization is going to be controlled, is going to be responsible to control this and to ensure that is going to be at the corporate, divisional, functional, and individual levels. And if I may pause here just one moment, let's talk about first line managers. As you know, employees view that organization through the eyes of their first line supervisor, or that supervisor that they have direct contact with each and every day. So ladies and gentlemen, never ever negate the importance of that first line supervisor and how strategically important that individual is to carrying out the organizational strategy that's being developed at the corporate level. A frontline worker never ever, or may never ever, see who the board of directors are or the CEO. That's not the person that they're interfacing with every day. It's that supervisor who sets the tone, who sets the motivation, who sets the criterion, who treats that first line employee as a human being and not just a number. So never ever underestimate the importance of a first line supervisor. And if you are a first line supervisor or desire to be a first line supervisor, make sure that you connect that dot, that your CEO of the organization has hired you, put you in that position to carry out the strategy of that organization. So it's up to you to to do that. You may not agree with it in all cases, and that's perfectly fine. Use the chain of command to complain back up through the organization, to express your concern, to exercise your voice. Please never ever complain down, because when you complain down, you're just giving your employees that green light to do the very same thing. So it's up to you, the first line supervisor, to carry out the desires and wishes of your CEO. And I certainly, as long as it's legal, it's ethical, you have that obligation as a person of management to do that. Otherwise, maybe, just maybe consider it being a first line, being in management, something you really want to do. Great opportunity. It's a great job because you have the opportunity to influence. But I'll stop there. But one last thing, please never, ever, ever underestimate how important that first line supervisor is in carrying out the strategy for every organization. Paramount. Okay, let's move on. So the types of different strategic control systems, starting over on page 408, is this personal control. One of the things that we typically see is a balanced scorecard, which again, we come back to financials, the rate of invested capital, or some of the strategic controls that most companies are pursuing to ensure maximum long-term profitability of the company. Several other controls that are used are personal, output control, and behavioral control. So let's look at each one of these a little bit here, starting over on page 408. And this personal control is that desire to shape and influence the behavior of a person in a face-to-face interaction in pursuit of the company's goals, i.e., how much influence a first-line supervisor has on the day-to-day operation of every organization. Again, there it comes right back to it, first-line supervisor. The output control is a system by which a strategic manager is estimating or forecasting appropriate performance goals for each division, for each department, for each employee, then how to go about measuring the actual performance relative to those goals. I know, probably like you, we have goals, then we have stretch goals. Those goals are the minimum requirements, and those stretch goals really are the one that's going to stretch us, that's going to force us to do things a little bit different, to stretch us, to help the organization to maintain its competitive advantage. And hopefully the stretched goals are developed to a point where they are achievable, but it's really going to incentivize us through financial compensation as one mechanism to improve the overall performance of the organization. And then the other one is behavioral control. And behavioral control really is about that comprehensive system of rules, procedures that's going to direct the actions or behaviors of the divisions, functions, or the individuals. And really the intent of that is not to specify the goals, but to standardize the way or means of which are reaching those goals. And these rules standardize the behaviors and make outcomes predictable, hopefully. And the result of that, if you have a performance appraisal system within your organization, that is one way in which we can monitor and hopefully correct any bad behaviors. And what we know, that any behavior that is allowed becomes behavior that is endorsed, that becomes the new organizational culture. So bad behaviors really should not be tolerated within any organization, and a robust performance appraisal process hopefully will help see that and get that corrected. One way in which managers can achieve their goals is developing and monitoring the operating budget over on page 409, and really is that blueprint that how managers is going to be intended to use their organizational resources to its maximum efficiency in achieving its organizational goals. And every organization should have an operating budget and be tracking itself, its costs and expenditures, as well as its revenues to that operating budget, because that budget is being used to predict what they're going to be doing in future years. Another way is through standardization, by which a company specifies how the decisions are going to be made to the employees, what type of behaviors is going to be allowed and what type of behaviors will not going to be allowed. And typically there's three things in which they can be standardized, and that's the inputs, according to pre-established criteria. Could be just-in-time inventory, could be the appraisal process, could be how they're going about doing their production processes. Another one could be the conversion activities as it comes about, how the program is done the same way every time, and that the goal with that is really the predictability of the behavior controls, the rules and policies and procedures are chief means by which that is accomplished, and then the outputs. The goals of the outputs is to specify what type of performance characteristics of the product or the services, what they're going to be. Excuse me. So they have the inputs, the conversion activities, then the outputs. One way we go about rewarding employees is through control system that's linking behaviors through the reward systems based on the company's strategy. And they will decide how to best reward their employees, what type of behaviors are going to be rewarded, how that's going to be linked to the reward structure. And it's these type of strategic decisions that determine the incentive structure for how that's going to affect the way employees and managers and levels in all organizations. And I'll come back to the Nucor Steel organization. If you were to review anything about that particular case, one of the things that jumps out to me is their human resources policies and the way they incentivize production, decentralize their decision making, and they really empower the local managers and the employees to increase their incentive through innovative techniques, using technologies, as well as developing their employees. And in fact, I want to remember that Nucor is one of the union-free steel companies in America, and their average wages are higher than the union plants, and it's based on their human resource development, the techniques that they use as part of their reward system. So very good case study if you're interested in understanding how the link between employee behavior and company performance or incentives. Well worth the read. So let's talk about organizational culture just for a few minutes, which is another element when it comes to successfully implementing a strategy. Organizational culture starts over on page 410, and it's really about what the organization values, what's its norms, what's its guidelines, what's its expectations that's going to prescribe the appropriate kinds of behavior that's going to be expected and or allowed by the employees in any particular situation. I know you studied business ethics. Business ethics is a key component of this, certainly, but business ethics is just one component of it. It's just about the organizational culture, how we go about learning that culture, what are the values and the norms of that particular culture, what's appropriate and inappropriate, what's going to be allowed, what's not going to be allowed, as I already indicated. How will that new employee come into that organization and be ingrained into that culture that hopefully is the culture that's about creating value for the organization as well as the customers to ensure its long-term profitability is what it's all about. So strategic leadership is equally important, is where it starts at the top of the organization. It is where the leadership style is transmitted from the top all the way down to that first line supervisor, all the way down to that employee, and hopefully they're sharing the same values. And it's that culture that becomes more distinct as its members become more similar. It's that leadership that affects the organizational culture to way to which managers act, the way they talk, the way they delegate, the way they divide their tasks, the way they interface with customers, as well as the financial community, as well as the business community, but equally important, the employees as well. Focusing on strategy, page 412, Sam Walton and Walmart is a good read to go about understanding how strategically important leadership's role is in establishing business culture. We know an organization will rise or fall with leadership or without leadership. So that's a good case to look at as well. Very interesting about how Sam Walton created that culture initially for Walmart and how Walmart has adapted that and became one of the largest corporations in America. So what are some of the traits of a strong and adaptive corporate culture? Over on page 413, few environments are stable for a prolonged period of time. Very few of our organizations are the same today as it was, say, 5 years ago, based on the changing business community in which we all operate in, or even from last week when we were in the working last week, because the environment, external environment changes so fast. Currency exchange rates, foreign government, civil distress in those particular third world or those foreign countries, government changing regulations domestically and abroad. I mean, changing oil prices. Anything externally has an influence, and it really has the ability to upturn any of our organizations in today's environment. And for organization to survive, managers must take action. They got to take action that's going to enable this organization to adapt to the environmental change. And one way they do about doing that is creating an adaptive culture. It's a way in which innovation is encouraged. It's a way in which risk-taking, acceptable risk-taking is encouraged by middle and lower managers, and it's the way in which organizations empower through decentralization of that decision making that allows it to change to its external environment. T.J. Peters and R.H. Waterman argued in our textbook that there's three common values of an adaptive culture. The first one was that they have a bias for action, that successful companies go about promoting that bias for action. This is emphasizing that there's autonomy and entrepreneurship, and employees are encouraged to take risk. Now, that's taking acceptable risk, not just off the cuff, cowboy off the hip type risk, but one that's well thought out, one's calculated, that they've done their homework. But it's really a bias for action. It's trying to be the innovator in the industries, the movers, first movers in the industry, and not waiting for the industry to come to them. The second set of values is the nature of the organization's mission. And that company must continue to do what it does best and develop a business model focused on its mission. Or in other words, what is its distinctive competencies? How can we maximize those distinctive competencies and do what we do best? I'll give you this example. Utility that's producing, that its main function of what it's doing to produce generation of electricity, that's their core competencies. I've seen some electrical utilities want to expand upon that and go out in telecommunications or even into energy management through selling services like commercial heating, ventilation, and air consulting services, things of that nature, and realize that from a portfolio, that sounds good to expand into new markets. But what some utilities recognize is that their core competencies was producing electricity. That's what they did best. So they returned back to their organization mission in some cases and divest themselves of those external market opportunities and refocus their efforts. This is the second value. The third value is how they operate the organization, and that organization should attempt to establish organizational design that motivates the employees to perform at their best. Apple, Google, Nucor Steel are good case studies about how that organization is set up to incentivize and motivate employees to do their best. Functional structure, page 414, is another way that we can group people in tasks to build competencies for companies. When you're doing a grouping by function, it's just that. It's that range of value chain activities that must be performed in a way that a company is grouping its functions, and that grouping of functions is where they have common expertise, experience, and they may even utilize the same resources. These functional strategies of grouping this common experience or expertise or resources. It has several advantages because people who perform similar tasks are typically grouped together and they can learn from each other and they become more specialized in doing that. One of the downsides of that is they become overly specialized and they're not developing their talent below those. When that person leaves or that function leaves, what happens? So that has advantages and disadvantages. They can also monitor and make sure that all performing tasks are done effectively and not shirking their responsibilities. So peer pressure in this second bullet here is paramount in how managers can leverage peer pressure and how that peer pressure can help improve performance by peer pressure. And also the last one, it gives managers control over their organizational activity. So it gives them more organization. So doing it by function, grouping those activities based on experience and expertise or using the same resources has some advantages, but equally important, it has some disadvantages as well. One of those being, again, that if I become over specialized and that particular person leaves, or what we like to call my go-to person, if my go-to person leaves the organization, and if I've not developed someone to step in that gap, then I'm going to have a significant learning curve for that organization. Strategic control is another way. It's a way about doing goals and targets so that all managers and employees can develop their performance measures that's going to stretch and encourage managers and employees to do more, to excel at what they're doing. Hopefully it ensures that employees will step across organizational lines and work together as they're developing their technical skills. And certainly when you're grouping by function, it makes this a lot easier as well. If you've heard the term management by objectives, this is what that is talking about. So they have the set of goals so that managers can manage by exception, intervening only when they sense something is not going right as well. But that's one way in which to do that as well. Over on page 416, we get into this developing a culture at functional level. Typically, three functions are typically discussed. That's production, research and development, and sales. And this is where, in the production standpoint, it's really focusing on improving efficiency and quality in the production process. Economies of scale, economies of scope, utilization of technology, reducing rework, quality improvements. Is really about how we can economize on cost and lower the overall cost structure, which is passed on to consumers, hopefully that it improves our market share, thereby increasing our profitability. Another one is research and development, where it's looking at the distinctive competencies in innovation, quality, and excellence to see what the customers want, what they need, and how that company can go about providing that particular goods and or service. It is really about the coordination of the research and development team, along with its designers, its production people, its sales, its customer service, its marketing. It's coordinating all those activities, again, with the end point in mind, being the consumers. And then the sales, we're working directly with the customers. They're in the field. They're employees who have their fingertips on the pulse of what the customers need, what they want, and it's really about how they can go about using that feedback as well with the research and development as well as the production piece to really look at how we can leverage our functional strategies to ensure we're meeting the needs and the demands of our customers. Really what that is all about. These functional structures and bureaucratic cost over on page 418, really no matter how complex the strategies become, most companies retain a functional orientation because of it has so many different advantages. And when you have different functions who work together, you potentially will have bureaucratic cost that's going to increase, which is going to lead to communication, measurement, and other potential issues that needs to be overcome. So let's look at a few of these very quickly. One of those being communications, where if you have functional hierarchies where they evolve, functions can grow more remote from one another, and it becomes increasingly difficult to communicate across functions and coordinate their activities. And it certainly can arise when we have differences in goal orientation. And I'll come back to this is how strategically important it is going to be that the leadership at the corporate level levelizes this and ensures that those barriers are broken down. How do we go about measuring is another activity. It's measurement of the product range as it widens, it develops new competencies and enters new market segments. You have customer problems that may arise as well as the more products that you produce, the more goods and services increase, the more different kinds of customers that you're trying to attract, the more customer demands and nuances that they have, the more tailoring that may be required to suit their new kinds of needs, which also increases the handoffs and additional problems in production and research and development. You may lose economies of scales because you're trying to tailor too much. Location problems, especially if it's a geographical region, may also hamper coordination control. Strategic problems, when you look at those three of areas of communication, consumers, and strategic problems, you can see the potential of bureaucratic cost increasing as well. And when you're experiencing one of these problems, you're more than not you're seeing an increase in the bureaucratic cost as well. Let's talk about outsourcing, page 419. That's a little more complex, where more and more companies are increasingly turning to outsourcing option as a way to solve some of these functional or bureaucratic costs, to overcome some of these organizational design problems by contracting with other companies to perform specific tasks. With specific tasks really is going to depend on the type of organization that you're looking at, but you don't want to give away any of your tasks that really defines who you are. This is really more about outsourcing those non-distinctive company tasks that in essence any type of organization can do, which lowers your overall overhead while protecting your proprietary, your technological competence, things of that nature. So you do this in a way that's not going to harm the company, but add value to the overall bottom line. And you're doing that to ensure you're reducing your bureaucratic costs, but you're doing it as a way to maintain your competitive advantage. Outsourcing labor over to offshoring was a big deal in the 90s, in the 2000s. You're seeing more and more companies bringing onshoring now because they have more direct control based on the changing economic and global environment of some of these countries as those wages have begun to increase, which is increasing their bottom line. So to have more control over that, you're seeing more production, more technology to maintain their competence. You're seeing more and more companies now coming back here to do onshoring versus offshoring. Here's how figure 12.6 over on page 420 as a way to look at the different organizational designs to increase profitability, one through implementing economies on bureaucratic costs compared to enhancing a value chain throughout the organization. In either case, it's really about developing an organizational design that's going to do this. It's going to lead to its competitive advantage. It's going to increase your return on investment. It's going to give you that distinctive competitive advantage so that that company can be survivable in the long term. So we're almost done with this presentation, ending up here with implementing cost through leadership and differentiation challenges. If we're looking at implementing cost leadership, it's really about becoming the lower cost producer in the industry by reducing cost across the board in all functions of the organizations. And it's really about a strategy where the company chooses a combination of structure control and that is in a culture that is compatible with lowering its cost structure while preserving its ability to attract its customers while maintaining their needs and desires. So being a low-cost leadership is really looking at becoming the low-cost provider in the industry. Implementing a differentiation strategy is just that. It's trying to find that balance between cost and being the differentiator in the industry so that you can pursue more market opportunities to serve greater markets to increase your market share. But that's really what implementing a differentiated strategy is all about. As you can imagine, that could become more difficult, especially if you are a company that provides standardized products. Now, how are you going to go about sharing, or excuse me, go about changing from a standardized product to become more differentiated, that you're providing a more market segment of different variations of customers' demands and or taste, which you can see already. We've already talked about the increase in bureaucratic costs because of the differences in the handoff and transfers, the communication problems, the location problems. It's going to increase, which may make this a difficult thing to do. So differentiation is a good thing, but if it's done with a balance of low cost. Another one of these deals with product structure. Really is one of those. It's tended to break a company's product line into smaller, more manageable subunits. That's going to reduce bureaucratic costs due to those communication problems, those measurements, and other problems. An organization that chooses a product structure over on page 423 first got to decide how it's going to divide its overall product line into groups of categories, which you see there in figure 12.7 in the Kia's case. Secondly, they got to keep their cost as low as possible. Their value chain support functions such as research and development, marketing materials, finance, or should be centralized to make the ability to make decisions and everyone follows to ensure the overall organizational objectives are being met. Another one of these is called market structure over on page 424, looking at very similar to customer groups, but instead, market structure looks at customer groups instead of product groups, where a company that's pursuing this strategy is increasing its responsiveness to its customers, where the employees may be grouped in functions, but it's all driven from a function that's going to improve customer responsiveness. And you see that over in figure 12.8 on page 424 and in figure 12.9 on page 425. It talks about this last one called the geographic structure, which is just that. It's looking at local, regional, or national structure and how we can integrate its functions to ensure geographically it's providing the products and meeting the consumer demands. Implementing a strategy in a single industry, one way of doing that is through the matrix structure. Matrix structure is pretty self-explanatory, where figure 12.10 on page 427 really looks at this basic structure and how that structure is developed, where activities could be grouped by function, could be grouped by product, but where employees are being shared across the organization. Certainly, when you do that, that structure is flat and decentralized, and employees inside of matrix. One of the greatest drawbacks is the potential of multiple bosses, 2, 3, 4 boss employees, who they're responsible for. But if it's set up correctly, and if the matrix is done correctly, it's clear who is the overall level of responsibility and how that employee is going to be, what's going to be their reporting structure and how that's going to work. Another one is product team structure, where it's set up in a product team. Its advantages is very similar to a matrix structure, certainly far less costly to operate because the way the people are grouped or organized. And you see that in figure 12.11 over on page 429. And hopefully it's done in a matrix, is done temporarily, where in some cases a product team structure may become more permanent in the way it is operating. And the next one is focusing on the narrow product line, and that could be based on the range of products, market segments, or customers, or locations. Could lead to a higher cost structure, especially if it's a cost leader or differentiator, because the outputs may be different as you're trying to tailor that to a specific customer or a specific customer demand. I believe these were the figures we talked about already on those pages. And lastly, as you talk about restructuring and re-engineering, especially in a single business company, it's where employees are streamlined. When you hear the terms, I used to hear the terms back in the 90s, restructuring, re-engineering, it really was about an organization that was trying to determine how we can provide to meet our customer needs, to provide profitability for our shareholders and stockholders at the least cost possible. And one way of doing that was to look at the organization, restructure the organization, do away with levels of hierarchy that was unneeded, do away with unvalue or low value creation activities. And it was really a way in which to rethink, retool the organization to become more flexible so that it can increase its measure of performance while lowering its cost, improve its quality and service, increase its adaptability and its flexibility and the speed in an ever-changing environment in which we live in today. But re-engineering, total quality management, or interrelative and complementary, and it's really about an organization that's really constantly looking at its structure and trying to determine how it can improve to ensure its long-term survivability and its profitability. Unfortunately, when you hear the terms restructuring and reengineering, it also deals with the potential of employees being laid off, outsourced, out of a job. But for the long-term survivability of organizations, it's absolutely paramount as well. So that concludes this particular topic when it comes to chapter 12 in our textbook, and thank you so much for listening.